Well, good afternoon. We're glad that you're here this afternoon to enjoy this, our special guest and the conversations that we've been having today. Let me give you just a few logistics as we get started. The cards that were in your seats, those are for writing questions for our facilitator to sift through and then to ask our special guest. And if you'd prefer, we have a microphone, an open mic there in the middle. And I've learned from the folks who helped bring Douglas Gresham to campus that he loves taking live questions. So if you want to not write it down, you just want to ask it on that mic, there will be time during the program for that to take place as well. Well, we're glad that you're here. It's been a special day already, and I look forward to the conversation that we'll have. I want to ask you all to welcome President Perrin as he begins the program.
Good afternoon. What a great thrill to be able to be a part of this and to welcome you. I'm glad you were able to. Is it just me, or am I hearing myself 3 times in the? Let's see if we can fix that. So glad you're here, and look forward to a really exciting hour. We've already had a great day with Douglas Gresham. We had a great chapel opportunity today. Christianity is not for wimps. That's the line I'm going to remember from our chapel time. And then a wonderful lunch session with some students. Great questions and really engaging. Got to hear some stories that you may get to hear some today. So it's already been a great day. We're so thankful to have Douglas here with us. I want to say a word of thanks to Gina and Mike Prather. They're sitting right down here, 2 wonderful LCU alums who have made it possible for us to have Douglas with us today. So let's show our appreciation to the Prathers for making this, and to Taylor, and to Loa. I'm really supposed to give the shout out to Loa, so I keep, let's make sure we also give Loa appropriate acknowledgement for their part in all of this. We're very thankful for them. Thank you. Well, we're in for a treat, and I'm going to go ahead and invite, we've got Dr. Kenneth Hawley, Associate Professor of English, who's going to be our moderator and going to facilitate the conversation this afternoon. Perfectly suited to do it, Kenneth, with his background in literature. Teaches classes here in Christianity and literature and film and literature, and has an expertise in medieval literature. So a great connection with with C.S. Lewis, and he's going to be our moderator. And I'm going to invite Kenneth, and I'm still going to introduce him, but I'm going to invite Douglas to come on up and take their places in the chairs. Let's welcome them to the stage, please. Douglas Gresham is a difficult person to introduce because his life is so fascinating. There's so much to tell. I could spend the whole hour doing that, but we want to hear from him. So I'm going to try to be very brief and succinct while still sharing a few reflections about our special guest. Well, probably the thing that most of us know immediately about Douglas Gresham is that he's the son of Joy Gresham and the stepson of C.S. Lewis. And that experience of growing up with that mom and then growing up in the home of C.S. Lewis as a young boy shaped him and formed him in so many important ways. But there's so much more to the story. He's an author. He's written a lot, but I've got these 2 books that he's written that I hope you'll take advantage of, maybe to have the chance to have him sign afterwards if you want to, or more importantly, pick them up and read them. That would even be better. Linton Lands, which is a great book about his childhood, and very, very good read. And then Jack's Life. The life story of C.S. Lewis, a wonderful and endearing story that really gives a different perspective on understanding the person of C.S. Lewis. I've really enjoyed reading them both. And he's written lots of other stuff as well. He's a movie producer, serving as an executive producer for the Chronicles of Narnia series. And we learned today in chapel that the fourth book, Silver Chairs, is in process. We're looking forward to its release and know that will be another grasp. I saw, could this possibly be correct, Douglas? $1.5 billion grossed worldwide from the 3 movies so far. Are we close? Yeah. That's a nice number. And you may hear about this today, but he's a music producer as well, and he's here right now because of a release of a music album that he's been working on and is very excited about. And we'll look forward to the chance to share in that as well. He's an actor in his own right as well. He's also a farmer, just to draw a contrast there. Dairy, pig, beef, he's done it all. He's a husband and the father of 5 children. He's a citizen of the world, born in New York, raised in England, has lived in Tasmania, Australia, Ireland, and now Malta. So that alone will occupy our time if we wanted to talk about all the things he's done and where he's lived.
Also a pilot and a sailor, by the way.
So much more we could talk about. He's a therapist, a pilot, a sailor. I mean, where do we start? The thing that I think is most significant for me today, and where he started his remarks to us in chapter today, is that he's a follower of Jesus Christ, someone who's committed his life to trying to live in that way. Someone that we've seen already today who is guided by the Holy Spirit. And you see it powerfully reflected in his words and in his manner and in his life. And it's that brings us together today, and that which will be the most rewarding as we engage in this conversation. So please, would you join me in welcoming Douglas Gresham?
Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to start, if we could, with the title of your autobiography, Lenten Lands. So here we are about to enter Easter itself, Good Friday, Easter. How do we come to understand the meaning of your title, and what does it mean for us here as we live in this land of Lent, approaching and anticipating Easter?
Lenten Lands comes from a very old poem that my stepfather kind of recast for an epitaph for my mother. And the line is that, I can't remember the actual quote. If somebody's got a copy of the book handy, may I borrow that for a second, please? Thank you. It's a long time since I read my own book. It should be in here, right at the beginning somewhere, I think. Do you know where it is? Yeah. No, that's not it. Show me. I only wrote the thing. I didn't put it together. You know, I don't know where anything
I
is.
was impressed by it and mindful of it as
Here we go.
said
Yeah.
it for me.
This is the epitaph that my stepfather Jack wrote for my mother. Here the whole world, stars, water, air, and field and forest, as they were reflected in a single mind, like cast-off clothes, was left behind, in ashes. Yet with hopes that she, reborn from holy poverty in Lenten lands, hereafter may resume them on her Easter day. It refers to the fact that, I'll just put that there for Tim, that we live in a shadowy, almost false existence here on earth. These are the Lenten lands. These are where we have not yet achieved or found the great glories of God, which we are going on to. Those of us who have committed our lives to Christ are, anyway. If you haven't, you're probably going to go commit your life to the other guy, and that is not a very sensible decision. But that's what it refers to, that we don't live in the real life yet. And if you remember at the end of the last battle in Narnia, they go from the shadow lands of Narnia, the Lenten lands of Narnia, into the real Narnia, Aslan's country. And the difference is remarkable.
Yeah, the term is over. Summer is here.
Exactly.
No more school.
Yep.
Also, the dream is ended, and now we wake.
Now it's real.
Yeah, this is
Which,
the real
of course,
thing.
is also the title of one of the songs on our album, or Meg's album, which
Oh,
I'm
very
producing.
good. So how do we
It
make
all
the
links
most?
together, doesn't it?
How do we then make the most of this life here in this land of Lent and shadows and school and dreams? How do we make the most of it while we're here?
Jesus put it quite succinctly, I think. 3 things are necessary: faith, hope, and charity. Now, charity I could talk about all day because most of us misunderstand it most of the time, but the faith is quite plain and straightforward. The hope, on the other hand, is not, oh, I hope it's real. The hope is constantly looking forward to the world that's yet to come, looking out of the Lenten lands, looking out of the shadow lands, forward into the glory of the reality of God's kingdom, which is where we'll be going. So I think that sort of sums it up.
Yeah, very good. You say in your book that in your early life you had the gift of education and experience. Could you describe some of those formative moments that you now see as gifts and not just things you did or achievements you accomplished?
Whew, that's a big question. There's 68 years of it. You know?
Yeah.
But yeah, the gifts of education I was referring to were not going to school. I have no formal education. Unlike you fortunate people, I never went to college. Well, I went to an agricultural college actually for a year, but I was determined to marry a certain young lady whom I was in love with, and I wasn't yet at that age. Those days, the age of consent was 21 years. You became mature at 21 years old. And my guardians wouldn't let me go off and marry this girl. So I deliberately failed my first year exams. I don't recommend this, but it was the only way I could get out of the college. And one of my lecturers took me aside and said, "Gresham, I know what you're up to. You're trying to get out, aren't you?" I said, well, yes, sir, I am. He said, why? So I produced a photograph of my intended, showed it to him, and said, oh, all right, I don't blame you. And she is still just as beautiful as she was the day I met her. And we've been married almost 50 years now. We've been together for more than 50 years, married for 48 of them, and forgotten almost every wedding anniversary. Sorry, what were we talking about?
Exactly that. That was just right. Yeah. Now, you lived near the woods in upstate New York. You
Sorry,
lived along-
one point.
Yeah.
When I said education, I must clarify that a little bit, I think. The education I received was by experience. I went through the process of watching my mother and father's marriage fall apart and them getting divorced. And I swore to myself that if I ever had children, I would not do that to them. And I watched my mother and I were then transported across to England, which is a very weird country to me. And I grew up in upstate New York, if you know that area at all. Stunningly beautiful, fireflies in the summer, snow in the winter. England was mostly grey, dark, cold, wet, miserable. And the people, they look weird. I mean, it's not so much today because it's become very cosmopolitan, but in those days, they talk like this, and things like that. And they dressed very strangely too. And of course, I read the Narnian stories and I'd read the King Arthur Knight stories, and I expected them all to be riding on horses and carrying swords and wearing armor. And I was really disappointed when it turned out not to be the case. And the stuff they eat, kippers and things, pork pies, anyway. Getting back to the point, the education was partly just suddenly being transplanted out of my comfort zone, my home which I loved, into this strange, wild and wonderful land of England. And then, of course, my mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and I learned an awful lot from that experience. And I actually had an incredible experience, which I will tell you about, because I think you deserve to hear about it. It's in Linton Land. But I was coming home from the hospital, having just been told that my mother was dying, expected to die in a few days. And I had to find my own way back. I was 10 years old, own way back to the Kilns, where I was staying with Jack and Warnie. And the pathway led through a churchyard of Holy Trinity Church in Headington Quarry. And there was a wrought iron gate that opened into the churchyard, and at the far side, another one to let you out again. And I lifted the latch on the wrought iron gate, stepped into the churchyard out of this world. I stepped out of the Shadowlands for a while. And I stepped into a super reality, which is almost impossible to describe in human language. But every leaf on the trees seemed to glow with their own inner light. The grass was super alive. Everything was more solid, more real. There was none of the sort of ethereality of our world, the shadowiness. And a very powerful presence was there, deeply compassionate and weeping with me. And he let me know that if I really thought I could not live without my mother, and she was the only human being I really knew in the world at that time, all I had to do was ask, and he could fix it. So I wasn't a religious child at that stage at all, although I was studying scripture at school, as we all did. I went into the church and I knelt at the altar rail and I prayed with every fiber of my little 10-year-old being that my mother be allowed to live. She went into a remission starting that night. Anyway, after I'd prayed, I walked out into this incredible place in the churchyard and down to the other wrought iron gate, and I opened the latch, stepped out of the real life and then back into this shadowy world. Now that's an education in itself. Now that did not make me commit my life to Christ. I knew who he was, I knew he was there, and I knew he would help me when I needed him, but I just went on being a boy, which boys do for a certain length of time. Some do for a very long time. But I went home and I didn't tell anybody. I didn't tell Jack, because it was intensely private for some reason. Anyhow, I went back to school and all this carried on. 4 years later, Jack and my mother got married, and they had the happiest 4 years of either of their lives. And 4 years later, I was called back home once again because the cancer had returned, as we all knew it would eventually. And I had exactly the same experience, not expecting it to happen twice at all. Lifted the latch, walked into the churchyard, zap, I'm in super reality again. It was so dramatic. It was rather like the old movie of The Wizard of Oz. You know, the house gets lifted up by the tornado, it's all in monochrome black and white, gets dumped in not Narnia, but in Oz. And Dorothy opens the door and steps out of the monochrome into living Technicolor. It was that massive an experience. And he said again, look, if you really still can't live without your mother, I can do it again. But I kind of thought it would be presumptuous to ask for the same miracle twice. And secondly, in all honesty, I was now 14, I had a family around me, I had Jack and Warnie and people I loved and cared for and who loved and cared for me. And I couldn't think of any more to say. It sounds terribly corny, but all I could think of to say was, thy will be done. and I walked out of the churchyard back into this artificiality in which we live, and my mother died 4 days later. That's an education. And it still didn't make me give my life to Christ. So I went on and just living through all the sorts of things that boys do, riding motorcycles and finally falling in love and getting married and emigrating to Tasmania and so forth. Many things happened in my life. The year after my mother died, a year and a half later, my father in America committed suicide. And the year after that, Jack died. And I had to cope with his desperately grieving brother, Warney, who was a binge alcoholic, who was drunk most of the time. I would be called by some publican and said, "Oh, right, we got the major down here and he can't sort of walk like. Can you come and get him?" And I'd have to ring a cab and go down and find him and bring him back to... Warney was one of the finest English gentlemen I ever met, but he did have this disease of binge alcoholism. And so that was another part of my education. This is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about education. I'm not talking about the books and the learning that one should achieve in one's youth. I never had the chance, in a sense. Emotionally, I wasn't fitted for it. I went on through life, married, had children, run farms and so on, and had adventures, basically. My whole life has been one series of adventures after the other. Some good, some bad, some indifferent, some not even quite boring, but close to it. You know? Basically, I'm still having adventures, and I'm loving every minute of it, because now my adventures are governed by Christ instead of me. And that's the thing.
You describe in some places your fascination with nature, living along the coast, living in the deep woods of upstate New York, appreciating with Lewis the outdoors on walks and things that kind of fostered in you a love and appreciation of the outdoors. It seems like there may be something there, something about a connection with nature that also fosters a kind of intellectual life and thoughtfulness, but also something that connects us with a vibrancy of life even as we age. You know, his assertion that we don't grow too old for fairy tales, that maybe we don't grow too old for loving walks in nature and picking up rocks and walking through streams.
I don't think I'll ever lose the fascination I have for reality in nature. I mean, one of the things that took me a long time to realize is the difference between us and the animal kingdom, is that we've got the choice. We don't have to be a rabbit. A rabbit has to be a rabbit. He can't do anything else. A fox has to be a fox. A fox can't choose between good and evil. He's just a fox. A wolf cannot choose between good and evil. He's just a wolf. And he goes on doing wolf things from the day he's pupped to the day he dies. We, on the other hand, have the chance to make choices as to what to do with our lives, what to be in our lives, how to run our lives, and how to let our lives interact with other people's lives. We have such a wide variety of choices, and that's an education too, learning about that. I've been a farmer all my life, off and on, still am, for that matter. And look, if I had my druthers, I'd live on the farm. But you can't commute from the farm in the middle of northern New South Wales in the mountains to Los Angeles and New York and other places that I have to go to work because of what the Lord has chosen for me to do. But I do love to be in the fields and the forest. You can learn so much out there too. For example, Mary and I are now, well, Mary's in her 70s and I'm about to be. If you dropped us with a shack or even without one in the middle of the forests of northern New South Wales, we would survive. How many people here could say the same? One. Good for you. Join the club. Yep, we're right up there. Just imagine what would happen if this global warming did what it's doing right now and made the whole world colder. I don't understand that at all, by the way. And all of a sudden things got really ice age and there's no petrol to buy, no gas at the station, no groceries in the grocery shops, and it all came to a grinding halt. Most of the population of the world would die within a month. Mary and I are just happy to go on killing our food and growing our veggies and, you know, making our own booze illegally. Doing all that kind of thing. But the world outside of cities fascinates and amazes me. I mean, I'm qualified to navigate ships at sea and airplanes in the sky, and I don't get lost in deserts. I don't get lost in forests. I don't get lost anywhere in the wilds, but I start lost in the city. One of my navigators, two of my navigators are over there, they'll tell you, they drive me the same place 5 times, I'm still lost, you know, and they know their way. And they're about a tenth of my age, you know, not well, a little bit more than that, but you know, I just don't think that human beings were designed to live in cities. I really don't. I think we're designed to live in the countryside where God has provided the food if only we know how to reap it, and husband it, and look after it, take care of it. So I don't know what the question was, but I hope that answered it.
That's it, yeah. Well, and the Pevensey children, they're pulled from the city to the safety of the countryside. They're pulled into Narnia, often into natural surroundings in the woods, on a mountain. And it seems like their journeys into Narnia actually help them become more fully who they're meant to be.
Absolutely.
You know, how is it that in many ways these films perform a similar function, right? As audience members, we get drawn into that world for a time, to a place where there's things like virtue and courage and honor and the kind of virtues that we don't often find in our world. How is making these films, kind of like what Lewis is doing by writing the novels in the first place, allowing people to enter into a world where they might better know who they're meant to be?
It's a difficult question to answer because I don't think you've asked, I don't think you've asked it correctly. The reason for me making those movies is for that purpose. That's why I make them. I mean, a lot of people would say you make movies to make money, and most people do. I made the movies because I think people need to learn these things back again. I really do. I think it's so important. And know how to relate to and realize that all of the creatures still have feelings. They might be, I mean, they don't love each other. They don't have that kind of romantic thing where you look across a crowded room and your eyes meet. And I've been talking about this to the girls. You know, it's all complete fallacy. It doesn't really exist, but people like to think it does, and they write songs about it, and the poets write about moons and spoons and June and all that stuff. But the truth of the matter is, animals don't have any of that worry. They carry on being what they are, and we should carry on being what we were designed to be, which is a holy creation under Christ. And we don't. We go off on all sorts of tangents, and we do all sorts of stupid things. We need to get back the virtues. And I make the movies very largely because I believe that so intensely that it's worth spending my life doing this. And I think that these things are coming through in the movies. I mean, I get emails from people who say, I never realized, and then I gave my life to Christ at the end of the thing. And this is just so moving and so beautiful when it happens. I think that the whole point of Narnia is to re-provide us with a knowledge of these great concepts, 19th century concepts, which the 20th century sort of threw out on the grounds they were old-fashioned. I mean, every century throws out everything from the previous one, like governments, you know. A party gets in and undoes everything the previous party did. It's kind of like that with the centuries. But it is, I mean, look at me. I grew up as a child with people who were born in and began to be brought up in and believed in the 19th century values. C.S. Lewis, his brother Warney, Fred Paxford, our gardener, people like that. They really believed in all of these things, and they taught me to believe in them. So then I had to stagger from the sort of 19th century thinking into the 20th century and made a real mess of it, just by the way. And then blindly and stumblingly emerged from the 20th century, having found my way back to Christ, into the 21st century. So I guess emotionally and intellectually I'm 300 years old, which probably accounts for how I look, you know. But do you understand what I'm getting at? That these things are so essential that I want to make the movies because of them. And I hope they really do react in people as they see the films. If not, we've wasted the books. You know?
Yeah, and at the end of Dawn Treader, what Lucy is told, you know, she won't be returning, but the whole reason they were brought into Narnia was that by knowing Aslan there, they might know him by another name back in England. Is there a similar way in which the stories and the films also not only help us learn various virtues of value to us, but the Lord himself, as you say?
I think so. I hope so, because that's why I'm making the movies as well. I mean, that's all part of it. I really hope, and I do know that I do get emails occasionally from people who say, you know, my son has been drifting and he suddenly saw the movies and it all changed, or whatever. Things of that nature do happen, which is glorious when it does. I'm always glad to hear stories like that. And people will come up to me occasionally, people I don't even know and don't know me, except they've seen me on television or something, and they come and shake my hand, just want to shake your hand because my child, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it does work. I mean, it is an evangelical thing, evangelistic thing, I should say, and it works. But there's so much to gain from Narnia, and to try to get it all into movies is very, very difficult. I've fought tooth and nail over some of these questions in making the films, but I think it works. I think we have stayed close enough to the books to get these messages across, and I know that, you know, that the kid who thinks he's going to hell because he loves Aslan more than he loves Jesus. It's an old story that this mother wrote to Jack and said, look, my son is really upset because he thinks he's going to hell because, I think that wasn't the phraseology, but he thinks he's wrong because he's loving Aslan more than Jesus. And Jack very quietly explained, very gently explained that Aslan represents Jesus, but in another world. Not just another world, but another multiverse, another omniverse. It's completely separate from us. So yes, I think it works. It does happen that way.
And the one that stands out to me is the Eustace episode there in Dawn Treader. And Aslan must be the one to peel away the layers of the self that had accrued in dragon-like form, and that he has to submit to that.
Yeah, we got some criticism over the way we did that in that movie, but we didn't think we really could have on screen a kid emerging from the skin of a dragon as it's ripped to shreds by Aslan's claws. It's just, we're not going to get a PG rating for that, I'm telling you right now. So we do have to work within the parameters of modern movie making. I would love to have had it done the way it was done in the book, but we would never have got that on the screen.
Yeah, what advice might you have? A number of our students here, fledgling writers themselves, often making short films. You're there, you say you fought tooth and nail. There is a place and there's a role for Christian filmmaking and storytelling. And what have you learned through this process that you could offer by way of advice to someone?
Well, as I said, someone asked me earlier, what advice would I give to someone wanting to get into the film business? I said, don't, which is what I usually say, because it is a very difficult one. I think it is time, and the generation may be approaching when Christianity or Christians take back the film industry. The film industry has been invaded very cleverly and subtly by the enemy of mankind and God, Satan himself. And I think Christians need to fight to get it back. And that doesn't mean making Christian movies. If you make a Christian movie, only Christians will see your Christian movie, and Christians don't need to see your Christian movie. It's the people who haven't found Christ who need to see the Christian movies. So what you need to do is find a wonderful adventure story, which woven within, like in Narnia, are the Christian principles and Christian truths that we all need to know about. And that's difficult. It isn't easy. Christianity, as I've said before, is not for wimps. It's tough. And you'll find huge opposition. As soon as you commit your life wholeheartedly to Christ, you are going to be tested, because the enemy's out to get you. He hates to see us escaping from his clutches and getting into the hands of Jesus, the wounded hands of Jesus. So we have to be aware that if we commit our lives to Christ and start to do what he wants us to do, really wants us to do, we will be tested. The devil will have a go at us. But a faith that is untested is untried, and therefore not worth very much. We have to go through the fire to find out if we can resist it and to make sure we can and to learn how to resist it. So I think that's it. If you go into the film business, into the film industry as it is today, you're going to be fighting the legions of Satan all the time. But it's worth doing simply because I think it's time Christians took the industry back and made better films than the guys who make the other stuff, more attractive films, more successful films, and pour the money back into Jesus' work. That's my answer to that question.
Very good, thank you. So when you're perhaps, or if you perhaps have a moment where you want to reconnect with Jack, you want to think about him for a time, which of his works do you pick up?
Whichever one's nearest to my hand at the time. Mm-hmm. I mean, the question is deeper than I'm just answering it. I'm a bit flippant there, but the point is, it doesn't matter to me which of Jack's works I pick up. I always learn something that I haven't thought of before. His stuff is so simple on the surface and yet so deep in content. If you start reading the Screwtape Letters, you suddenly think, wow, why didn't I see that before? Start reading Miracles, oh, never realized that. The one book, fiction book of his, which does this more than any other, more than Narnia, is Till We Have Faces. Now, I've read that book probably between 15 and 20 times now. Every time I read it, I find new stuff in it. Now, I don't think that God is changing the type while I'm not looking, but there's just stuff that I haven't twigged before. Suddenly it hits me, and wow, so that's what that means. And this is a kind of Christian education, I think, that the Lord gives you just as much as you can handle at a time. When you're a kid, you try to eat lots of ice cream, and it chokes you up, and you get a headache and all this stuff. You can't eat it at that age. Now I can eat as much as I want, you know. So I think this is somehow, I think this is slightly the way God works. He feeds us on milk when we're baby Christians. Then he starts giving us the strong beef, strong beer, when we're old enough to take it in Christianity.
You said when you...
Just a second. If you've got questions on those cars, pass them to the outside of the room. We'll pick them up in just a minute, okay?
I do like people to come and ask. I love live questions.
Please use the mic if you're up to that. It's okay when you're ready to kind of...
Yeah, sure. Okay? You said in growing up in the difficult years with your father back in New York that you learned how not to do that with your own children.
No. I didn't learn how not to do it. I learned that I would never, ever...
Chose not to do it.
No, I'd never let a divorce happen if I could possibly avoid it.
Yeah.
My wife also came in out of a difficult family. And she just thought to herself, I'm never going to do this to my kids. I'm never going to divorce, never going to separate with my husband. Because it does hurt the kids so much. And we both decided, before we were married, we decided that divorce wasn't an option. And we have been through some really rough times in our marriage, like everybody does. I was a conceited son of a... Well, let's not go into that. Anyway, arrogant, conceited, strong-willed, stupid, all the things you can imagine because, well, I made the mistake of thinking that whoever was running my life when I was a kid was doing a pretty lousy job of it. And if you look back at the evidence, it's a pretty fair assumption to make. So I thought, well, that's it. I'll take it over myself and run my own life. This meant that I was trying to run my own life, therefore worshipping myself and therefore having a fool for a deity. And it took me a long time to work out that this just doesn't work. I'm not qualified to run a human life, least of all one as complicated and crazy as mine, you know. Mm-hmm. So I looked around for whoever was, and of course it turned out to be Jesus. Yeah. And I had to go back to the Maker's instruction book, the Maker's manual, and read how to run a human life and let him do it, and let him take over.
And as you raised your own children, looking back on your time with Jack, do you find yourself drawing on some of the lessons you learned from him, the way he was with you?
Well, to start with, I was a lousy father in many ways. I love my kids and they love me and we always have, but I was career-oriented at one stage because I'd brought up in a society which believed you had to get on, you had to get ahead. They never told me what to get ahead of, which I think is where people go wrong. They say, you've got to get ahead in life. Get ahead of what? You know, it's a mystery to me, but anyhow, got to get on to where, to what? But I was always taught you had to get, you had to get rich, you had to work hard, you had to, and so on. I didn't really want to do any of that stuff, but I felt I had to. So I became a broadcaster, and it just happens that I have that voice that when I tell people to buy things, they go and buy them. I got a problem with that in the end in the commercial world because I suddenly realized I was conning people into buying things they didn't need with money they couldn't afford to spend, you know. I sold 2,000 tons of chicken manure to an urban population on one occasion. The highlight of my broadcasting career. Still known for it. I hate to tell you this, but in certain circles of Western Australia, I'm known as the chicken shit man. Spool ahead 30 years from that occasion, just by the way, and a lady shows up at our ministry with problems, and I can't remember what her problems were, but she showed up at our ministry with some psycho-emotional problems. And after a week there, she started to look at me very strangely. And finally she said, Doug, I've got to ask you a question. I said, what's that? She said, were you ever in Australia? I was absolutely, wasn't looking for this. They were not expecting this at all. I said, well, yes, I was. She said, you didn't live in Perth, in Western Australia by any chance, do you? I said, yes, I did. She said, were you ever in broadcasting? What on earth is this about? So I said, well, yes, I was. She said, I know you. You're the chicken shit man. And in those days, you couldn't use that kind of word on broadcast radio or television at all, or you got fired. So I had to ad-lib 6 60-second commercials on chicken manure every night, 5 nights a week, because that's what the sponsor asked for. And I sold his entire product 2 weeks early. He ran out of time. He ran out of product before he ran out of advertising. He had to cancel the last 2 weeks of his advertising.
Difficult for a man of courage to have an epithet like that, isn't it?
This is why you shouldn't get into broadcasting, guys. I'm telling you.
One of the questions from the audience is about funny moments with Lewis. You report him having a boisterous laugh.
He was great. He was a man of great humor. Terrific, sharp repartee at our dining table every night. And if I'd had a tape recorder and recorded it, the stuff would be worth millions today. But one of my favorites is the time when my mother had asked him to do something, or I can't remember exactly what it was, but she said, oh, Jack, did you do so-and-so? And he said, of course, my love. What do you take me for, a fool? My mother snapped back, no, I took you for better or worse. That was very typical of the kind of stuff that was happening at our table all the time. It was a fascinating place. That was an education too, just growing up, listening to those conversations. One of the things you need to know about Jack and my mother, Jack never forgot anything he'd read, quite literally. Sometimes students came into his tutorial and they'd heard this around the university's gossip that Lewis never forgot anything he'd read. And then they would challenge him on it and say, is this true, Dr. Lewis? And he'd say, well, go to one of the bookshelves here, and of course his whole rooms were lined in bookshelves, and pick a book at random. So the guy would look for the dustiest, most forgotten-looking book on the shelf and pick it up. And Jack would say, open it, and he'd open the book. Read me the first line of that page. The guy would read him the line, and Jack would continue to quote the book until they told him to shut up. He had that kind of memory. My mother was equally gifted at the same time. She was quite capable of picking up the score book of a Mozart concerto for the piano, reading the book, and then putting the book down and playing it on the piano. She never forgot anything she'd read either. So imagine these two people, totally isolated by their own intellectual abilities, suddenly meeting each other. What's going to happen? There's absolutely no alternative but to fall in love and just get together one way or another. This is what happened.
And he'd found something in her he'd found nowhere else.
She was the only person in the world he could speak to and talk to on his own level. And she had similar problems. I mean, he was the only man, really, she'd ever met who could converse with her on her own level.
They truly admired one another.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. I never heard them ever have a row. I mean, they only had 4 years, so they didn't have long to practice, but I never heard them get angry with one another, except once, when he was angry. This is a story which is kind of sad in a way, but my mother and my stepfather, toward the end of things, decided they both longed to see Greece, because they'd read all the mythologies and they loved ancient Greece. So they took a trip to Greece with Roger Lancelin Green, another fabulous writer, who was a great family friend of ours, and his wife June. And in Greece, my mother was pretty badly ill by this stage. The cancer was re-emerging. And they were heading up to the hill, up to the Acropolis or somewhere, or the Lion Gate at Mycenae or something. And my mother just felt she couldn't go any further. And so Jack said, well, we'll just sit down here on this fallen column and rest for a while and see how we feel. And there was a regrettably American lady of a particular American kind, who pointy glasses out here and over made up and the whole bit. And she was obviously a bit jealous because the whole party were paying so much attention to my mother and kind of ignoring her. And she came up alongside where they were sitting and she said, you didn't get very far, did you? And Jack snapped for a split second. His control snapped. It's the only time I've ever heard of it happening. And he said, oh, go and have a heart attack. When my mother was telling this story later, she told me that the woman did exactly that. She walked up to the top of the hill and collapsed with the coronary. And they had to call an ambulance, and men came up, rushing up with a stretcher and brought her down again and took her away. And in the telling of the story, I must confess that my mother told this story with a little bit of glee. Jack, on the other hand, was absolutely mortified. He was horrified, disgusted with himself, and enraged with himself that he had called down a satanic curse on someone and seen it come true. He was really upset about it, and he made my mother promise never to tell anyone that story again, but he didn't make me promise. So, I mean, that was kind of a bit of a difference between them, you know.
Speaking of funny stories in matrimony, your own journey with your wife had a few bumps at the start, a few unanswered
I learned some
proposals.
important lessons.
She confronted you about your behavior, set you straight.
She did. That was very early. That was actually just after I fell in love with her. She pointed out that I was behaving like a conceited idiot, which I was, and still do sometimes. Because I know I'm pretty flash, you know. No, wait a minute. Out of date. Sorry, that's a century ago. I'm pretty cool. But anyway, yeah, she saw me, you know, behaving stupidly at the farm, and she just told me the truth about myself. This was a girl I'd only met 2 days earlier. Just told me a strip off me, just untold. And the result was, I fell more deeply in love with her than ever. This person told me the truth. And that's rare, you know, it is kind of rare. But one of the best and funniest stories I can remember about my journey to Christ, or with Christ, in the beginning, my son James was and still is, a very attractive man. I mean, he's nearly 50 now, but he was a very attractive young man. And he had this kind of fan club of young women that used to follow him around like a shadow, and almost like a school of fish. You know? And one day, James and I were working on his car. He'd bought a Volvo, a car that we'd had for years. He bought it off as his first car. And the exhaust pipe needed replacing. So we were working in the pit on the farm and with the oxyacetylene torch. And accidentally, I passed the burning acetylene torch over his thumb. Across the ball of his thumb and just blew the skin away, you know. So at the same time as this happened, we dashed in and bandaged him up and so forth. And I went back to work on the car. But he came with me. And the phone rang. And my wife picked up the phone. It was one of 3 of the main fan club members, James Gresham fan club, who said, Mrs. Gresham, we've got a problem. We've got this dangerous horse that we need to move from Ledgerwood, which is a village down the road about 2 or 3 miles, to Ringarooma, which is where we lived. And we're scared to ride it. Do you think James could come and ride it for us? Because James is a very accomplished horseman still, better than I am now. And Mary, knowing I'd become Christian all of a sudden, she could tell me what to do, said, no, James has just been injured, hurt himself or been hurt working on a car, but I'll tell you what, Daddles, that's my nickname, Daddles will come and ride it for you. So I come in the house and Mary's got a grin on her face, and what's going on? And you got to go down to Ledgewood and pick up this dangerous horse and ride it back. Oh, thanks a lot. But anyway, so I said, all right, and grabbed the saddle, and down I went. And my other Christian friend of mine, who was a very fine guy, and still is probably, I haven't seen him for years, but he was the shoesmith, he was the farrier, and he'd just sort of tidied this horse's hooves up. And he took me aside and he said, listen, Doug, you be very, very careful with that animal. The horse really is insane. So I said, well, thanks, Phil. So we tacked up the horse, got the saddle on and bridle and everything, and I climbed into the saddle. And the girls loved it because it meant that James came down the car and he was going to drive them back to the village. So they got to sit in the car with James. And they said, well, man, off they went. So I started out on this horse, ready for anything, really ready for trouble. And I soon realized the horse wasn't actually crazy. He was just very silly. Because he would come across a cigarette packet or something lying in the grass and go into a paroxysm of fear, leap sideways across the road and jump and pig root and all this sort of stuff. And I thought, it's a silly darn horse. So anyway, I started to try and work him to really get his trust that he would be quite safe. And we go up the road a little way and we come to turn off going up the main road from Ledgewood to Ringarooma. And about 60 yards down the road, there was a bridge over the river. And that was the first problem. We get to the bridge and the horse just doesn't like the look of this rise. And the horse was interesting. If a car came down the road towards us, he just went bananas. If a car came from behind him and he didn't see it, didn't even notice it. Just, So I began to realize this horse was not overly intelligent. Even as horses go. So we get to just before the bridge, and on the far side of the bridge is a character called Herbie Worker. And he had a house cow she milked for his home. He had no land, so he used to peg it out on the side, on the grass verges on the side of the road. And the horse took one look at Herbie, which isn't surprising, but the other look at the cow, and it also wasn't a very attractive cow, and just lost it. And you've seen the horses, what they do in the rodeos when they're trying to buck people off. Well, and of course, by this time, half the locals in Ledgewood are out on the street watching the show, And someone said, yeah, ride him, Doug. And others are saying, chuck him off, horse, chuck him off. And I fought the horse back under control, and I said to the horse out loud, you stupid animal, why don't you just learn to trust your master and everything will be all right? And a voice crashed into my empty head, look who's talking, son. That was God talking directly into my mind. Look who's talking, son. I thought, oh, yeah, well, all right. A very important lesson learned from a very stupid horse. Now, Balaam used an ass to talk the Lord used an ass to talk to Balaam, so he could obviously use a horse to talk to me, but it was actually his own, God's voice, that still small voice. He doesn't shout. When he shouts, the earth will come to an end, but he doesn't shout. He just whispers gently into one's mind, and you think, oh, Lord, I'm so sorry.
When reading of your pursuit of your wife, even the literal pursuit on her birthday through the rain, I couldn't help but think of this hound of heaven that Lewis describes as tenaciously pursuing those he loves.
My pursuit of my wife was really cunning. That's one thing I do have is cunning. I'm really bright about some things. You've got to remember that I was 18 years old, shaving twice a week if I was lucky. No, unlucky maybe. But Mary's suitors were mostly lawyers and doctors. She was a nurse in London, and I was really up against it. But I came up with all sorts of various nefarious ways of winning her approval. And the bit about you eventually hitchhiking down to London on her birthday. Having bought her a present which cost me every cent in the world that I had at the time, and mailed it to her, and it hadn't reached her. I didn't know that at the time. I arrived at the flat, which she shared with other girls, rang the doorbell, and on the way into this place in St. James's Square, St. George's Square, I beg your pardon, I found a barrow boy. Anybody here been to London know what a barrow boy is? No? Okay, well, this is a guy who's got a push cart, and he loads it up with things he thinks people are going to want to buy, and wheels it out and sells them. And this particular was in October, which is very cold sometimes in Britain. And this guy had imported carnations on his barrow. And I had just about 2 or 3 pounds left. I can't remember what the sum was. It's inland lands probably. And saw these flowers. Well, Mary'd love those. So I went over to the bloke and said, how much are the flowers? And he told me the price, and I can't remember it off the top of my head now, but it was more money than I had, just. So I said, oh dear. He said, what's the matter, mate? I said, well, it's my girlfriend's birthday, and I don't have very much money. And he said, right, I'll tell you what, mate, I'll give you a dozen for such and such, which was the last bit of money I had. And my wife's birthday is on the 13th of the month of October, so. And I said, well, that'd be wonderful, thank you. And I started to pay, and he said, what the heck, I'll give you another one for free. Chucked another one, so she got 13 beautiful carnations with a wonderful scent. wrapped up in tissue paper and the whole bit. And I walked down the road, and absolutely exhausted, having hitchhiked through the rain and the storms and so forth, all the way from Shropshire to London. And rang the bell. And one of the girls' boyfriends, other girls she shared the flat with, came and answered the door. And I told him who I was, and he said, "Oh, come in, come in." And led me into the sitting room. And Mary was sitting in a high-back chair with her back to the door. And I leaned over, thinking I was being real smart. Leaned over there and just dropped the flowers in her lap and said, "Happy birthday, darling." And she just burst into floods of tears, sobbing her heart out. I thought, she doesn't like carnations. What did I do wrong, kind of stuff, because I'm a little paranoid at the best of times. And the other guy, just very tactfully, and his girlfriend left the room and went off to the kitchen on the other side of the flat or something and left us alone. And I just knelt at her feet and cuddled her, and I didn't know what the heck was going on. And it was ages before she could speak. She was so heartbroken. And finally, she revealed to me that everybody in the world, her entire family, brothers, sisters, or sister, and parents, everyone in the world, and even her flatmates, except me, had forgotten her birthday. And that was when she decided to marry me. I think, anyway.
Well played, sir.
Yeah,
Well played.
absolutely. Yeah.
One of the questions from the audience asks if you've spent time or had a chance to spend any time with J.R.R. Tolkien when you were.
Well, I knew Ron Tolkien, or Tollers as we generally called him, as my stepfather's best friend. I mean, I was just in my teen years and wasn't really interested in literature and things in those days. Me, motorbikes, shotguns, poaching pheasants on other people's property, all that kind of stuff. And a few girls now and then I would sort of get interested in. Oh, I had a lovely experience when I just got my motorbike. I'd have been 16 at the time. I was riding down Cornmarket in Oxford, and it was a wide street. And in those days, the traffic wasn't anything like what it is today. But the policemen used to stand at the crossroads. You got guidance by cops, traffic cops. And I was looking at a young lass called Doreen, whom I knew, and I was very fond of, or becoming very fond of. It was one of these across the room, meet the shining eyes stuff. And doing about 5 miles an hour slowly in the traffic coming up to the intersection. All of a sudden, I was looking at Doreen and grinning, and bang, something hit me across the front of the helmet. Slammed on the brakes and stopped dead. I had just driven into the back of a policeman's hand who was holding it out to stop the traffic. And he looked across at me, and he looked at where I was looking, he looked back at me, and he said, "Yeah, well, she's worth it, mate, but don't do it again." Why did I tell you that story?
It's a good story.
It's a good story. Well, there we go. I'm a writer by nature.
What
was the question? I'm sorry.
It was about Tolkien.
Oh, Tollers, yeah. I knew Tolkien vaguely as my stepfather's best friend, and I just normal talks of a boy to a man kind of stuff. But when Jack was dying in hospital years later, I didn't know. This is an important point. I knew my mother was dying. I never knew Jack was. I knew Jack was sick, ill. I mean, I knew he was pretty ill, but I didn't think he was going to die. Nobody told me. Always tell the kids. It is infinitely better, in my experience, to know that somebody's dying, to expect it, and to do the whole bit of grieving, but you've had the foreknowledge. To suddenly find your stepfather dead, or your father, or anyone you loved dead, is much, much worse. So if you're ever in that situation, do tell the kids. But anyhow, I went to visit Jack in hospital. This is going to turn into another rambling story, which I may have to come back from, but it's kind of important. I went to visit Jack in the hospital when he was pretty ill, and he was lying in bed. And we chatted, and it was just pure Jack. He was a normal guy, the way he always was. He was just ill in hospital. And suddenly he said, "Oh, Doug, by the way, hadn't you better be getting down to the railway station?" I said, "What for?" He said, "Oh, didn't Mrs. Miller tell you to pick up the au pair girl?" I said, "What au pair girl?" He said, "Oh, Mrs. Miller should have told you. We've got an au pair girl from Paris coming to stay in the house to help Mrs. Miller with the cleaning and stuff." Now, 16-year-old kid, au pair girl, hey, So I said, "No, she didn't tell me." And he said, "Well, you better get down there and collect her." So I said, "All right." And he told me the name of the girl, Marie Claire somebody or other, I think it was. And I said, "Well, I'd better call a cab." And he said, "Yeah, you better do that." So I went off and I called the taxi, and the taxi came a few minutes later. And I went back to Jack, and the taxi driver was a lady who, shall we say, was somewhat concrete in personality. And I went back to Jack and said, "Jack, can I have some money, please?" He said, "What for?" I said, "Well, to pay the taxi driver." He said, "What taxi driver?" I said, "The taxi driver to go and pick up the au pair girl." Jack said, "What au pair girl?" I said, Jack, 10 minutes ago you told me that there was an au pair girl coming to help Mrs. Miller in the house from France, and I had to go down to the railway station and pick her up. And he laughed. He said, Doug, I'm sorry, it must have been a complete hallucination. I don't know what you're talking about. And I said, Jack, you just told me all about this, and I phoned a taxi. He said, well, I'm terribly sorry, Doug. It must have been a complete hallucination. And he started laughing. He said, you know, all I've got left, my body has failed me. All I've got left is my mind, and now that's going too. And he laughed about it. Because as Jack approached death and got closer and closer to it, he drifted further and further from the church and closer to Christ. And there is a difference. He was moving away from Anglicanism and turning to Christianity and Christ himself. I think he could almost see over the threshold at that point. So I had to go to the matron of the hospital and borrow some money to pay this taxi driver to go away and get it put on Jack's bill, which was an embarrassing situation. However, getting to the point of this story, the first point that he was getting closer to Christ is important for us to realize. As we get close to death, we also go close to Christ. That's something we need to know and revel in. But I went outside in a great deal of turmoil about Jack, and I had to go and find my bike and ride home. And I ran into Ron Tolkien outside the hospital. He said, oh, Douglas, excuse me. I said, yes. He said, you won't remember me, but I'm Professor Tolkien. I said, of course I remember you. And he said, look, if anything untoward should happen to Jack, and you have nowhere to live, come and live with me. I said, well, Professor Tolkien, that is a wonderful, wonderful thing to offer. And I'm very, very grateful, but as it happens, I do have somewhere to go. It's, you know, if anything should happen to Jack, my mother's best friend in England has always said that she would take me in. And I've never forgotten that. It was something that Tollers came out with just off the top of his head. He made this enormous offer. One thing that always does frighten me about it, though, is if you can imagine inheriting a responsibility to look after Toller's copyrights as well as Jack's, I probably would have died years ago.
A tough gig. You know, you describe there's Jack's commitment to, in a sense, hiding some of his suffering, keeping from others the pain, the osteoporosis, the difficulties of his later life. A kind of Christian commitment to that, in fact, hid from you what was really happening.
Yes, that is true. One of the most significant things, I think, of Jack's ability to protect his friends and his loved ones from his own pain and his own grief was the day after my mother died. He had it was in the summer, beautiful day, and he had an appointment with Donald Swan and the librettist of an opera of one of Jack's works. I can't remember which one off the top of my head. And he didn't remember to cancel the appointment, so they came. And Jack said, well, let's walk around the gardens while we talk about this. It's a lovely day. So they walked around the gardens for a while, talked about the problem with the libretto or whatever it was. And finally, they'd solved the problems. And Jack said, please, you'll have to excuse me. You see, my wife died yesterday. And shattered with grief, he stumbled away into the house. Donald Swan couldn't believe it. The man had told no one, and yet he'd kept this commitment, because he'd made a commitment, with this footling little opera, whatever it was. He kept the commitment when he was dying inside. And they never realized until he apologized for the fact that his wife had died. What kind of a man is that? That takes such courage, such strength. But that was the sort of man he was. But I see we have some people waiting at the microphone.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't know the procedure, so I just walked up.
Yeah, why not?
I read once from Peter Kraft, he suggested that if C.S. Lewis could pick any one work, essay, lecture, book, anything, that he was sure everyone would read, it would be his lecture and essay, Man or Rabbit. And I wondered if...
I don't think I know anybody who's read that.
Well...
But you have to remember, Jack was quite convinced that 5 years after his death, nobody would ever read his work again.
Well, I just wondered if you had any insight into the matter. If you thought that he could pick any one work that everyone would read and honestly consider what it might have been.
Of his own works?
Yes.
Well, he thought the very best thing he'd ever written in terms of fiction was Till We Have Faces, and I agree with him. But he really didn't think anybody would read his works 5 or 10 years after he was dead. He said, no, it's just, I mean, that's just not going to happen. People forget me, they forget everybody else. Why won't they forget me? He was convinced. Mind you, I've spent most of my life working to prevent that from happening, so maybe I'm responsible to some degree for that. But I don't think he would have even thought about any of his books ever being read by everybody. He wouldn't imagine that would happen. Wouldn't be in his way of thinking at all.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Hi, I have a question about the problem of Susan. Susan Pevensey from the
I didn't know there
Chronicles
was
of
a
Narnia
problem with
books.
Susan, but
And, well, I've seen some essays that that's what they call it. Susan Pevensey was no longer considered a friend of Narnia. Do you think that when she died, she would have gone to Aslan's country? And if so, do you think she would have gone to the New Narnia or to the New England?
I have absolutely no idea. And the reason for that is while we Christians are commanded to be discerning, we are not permitted to judge. That's not our function in life. We don't judge. We're not allowed to. So I'm not going to make that judgment. But I will tell you this. I think it's up to 12 now, people who have written to me and said something like, I have just written a fabulous 8th Chronicle of Narnia. My children tell me it's wonderful, and my wife thinks it's great, or husband. All my friends love it. So can I send it to you, please, for publication? And I save Susan. And I write back and say, not on your life, mate. But in very polite English terminology. Because Jack didn't leave Susan hanging for no reason. We mustn't think that all of us go to heaven automatically. Because we don't. Those who do not commit their lives to Christ, who choose to go to the other place, just don't make it. We don't know what happens to Susan. We don't know whether she does eventually find Christ as I did later in life, in terms of commitment. We don't know whether she becomes a crack addict and robs banks and kills the Pope. We just don't know. We cannot judge her anyway, even if we were permitted to, because we don't know. Jack left her hanging in cyberspace, because we mustn't think that we all make it automatically, because we don't. Some people go to hell by their own choosing. And she may have been one of those who chose not to have anything to do with God or Aslan ever again and went the other way. She may, on the other hand, have embraced Christ wholeheartedly. And if she had, she would go to the New England and the New Narnia simultaneously, because they are the one. As they get further into the distance, as they float past, they join. Because Narnia was Jack's impression of heaven when he was a little boy. That's why he wrote it the way he did. Does that answer the question?
I think so.
I'm glad. I wasn't sure about that.
Cassidy's a little modest here. She's written a wonderful poem speculating about this. If I find a way, I'll try to get it to you for you to enjoy. You mentioned Tolkien, and you mentioned Jack's kind of assessment of his own work and who would read it. You mentioned that when it came to their most famous works, what would later become their most famous works, Tolkien hesitated to publish Lord of the Rings. Jack encouraged him to do so.
No, it wasn't just that he hesitated. Tolles was a guy, if you made the slight, you had to be careful criticizing any of his books. If you made the slightest critique, which he believed to be correct, he would rewrite the whole book. And not just start at that paragraph and correct the little bit that you criticized, but either the whole chapter or the whole book or the whole volumes of stuff. And he would enjoy doing it. He loved doing it. But also, Tolles did eventually submit the Lord of the Rings for publication. The Hobbit was published quite quickly. But the Lord of the Rings was turned down by, I think, 7 publishers. Because, nobody reads this kind of stuff anymore, or nobody's ever going to read this kind of stuff, or whatever. And Alan Unwin, I think it was the publisher. And Jack kept encouraging, keep sending it. There's lots of publishers, keep trying. And Alan Unwin and Son, I think it was, the guy had a 12-year-old son. And he said, this is fantasy, Read this and tell me if we should publish it, to his 12-year-old son. He said, Dad, you've got to publish this thing. It's going to make millions. So he published it. And it made millions. And it's still making millions.
Do you have a handle, you think, on what it is that they're tapping into? What have they tapped into, Tolkien and Lewis both?
Same thing.
Yeah.
Both the same thing. First of all, Tolles put it extremely well. He said, all wars are lost. The war goes on. He's writing about the war. It's this constant, never-ending struggle between good and evil. And the commanders are both, Christ and the devil. And that's what we see in The Lord of the Rings. It's well camouflaged there. And we see
Without
it,
and within.
sorry?
Without and within.
Yes,
Right.
yeah. But we also see it rather more plainly in, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, certainly, and in the rest of the Narnian stories. That's what they were dealing with. And if you look back in time and you read the stories of the Grimm's fairy tales and the Hans Christian Andersen stuff, and a little bit less. But if you read the George MacDonald material, I don't know if anyone here familiar with George MacDonald's writings? Okay, all of the rest of you, get in the library, read George MacDonald. Read it for the next 6 weeks. Don't stop. I'm just rereading his entire works, by the way, for about the umpteenth time. And I read it off my Kindle. I've got the whole library in my Kindle. Actually, I read it off my iPad to be perfectly precise, but it's my Kindle account. Because George MacDonald is the writer of whom Jack said, I never wrote a single word that was not influenced by George MacDonald. But it's this great struggle between good and evil. And it's going on in this room as we speak. Because there's always somebody, some little imp, whispering in your ear about something, which you really shouldn't do. You know? So it's a war that will be going on until Jesus comes back and always everybody out of the pool, you know? Which he will do in the not too distant future. In his terms, in our terms, it might be a long way down the track yet. We just don't know. And that's the great thing. We don't know. We're never going to know. I mean, if you suddenly were told, and you knew it was true, the world was going to end next week, wouldn't you be a really well-behaved guy for the next few weeks? You know? It doesn't work like that. It's going to come out of the blue. And all these people who say, oh, last time we're living in the, end times. Well, of course we're living in the end times. They started when Jesus was born. And they're going on until it stops. And we are not ever going to know when it's going to happen. It's just suddenly going to loom out and grab us. And a lot of people want it to happen in their lifetime. Conceited fools. I'm going to leave it to God to make that decision.
You mentioned in the climactic moments, the devastating moments, when we lose everything, that's actually a moment of beginning, not a moment of ending.
When everything is lost, and when everyone is lost, you look around and you think, who the heck can I turn to? And if you have any brain at all, you suddenly realize there is only one person left, and that's Jesus Christ. When I reached the absolute depths of despair in my life, over my own behavior, mind you, I turned around and thought, there's only one person qualified to fix this, and that's Jesus Christ. So I handed my life to him, and boy, it's been a great ride ever since, you know.
Very good.
Well, we're close to the end of the time. Is there one last question? Are we good?
You mentioned a few times the various things you've done.
I knew there would be.
Pilot, navigator, farmer, working a drill, broadcasting, all these, now a sense of calling in ministry. Did you see those, and I guess maybe you have a different perspective now, at the time in many cases you were doing what had to be done to put bread on the table?
Not always. The sailing was fun.
Good.
The aerobatic flying was fun. The motorbikes were fun. But they all do mesh to a certain extent. Yeah.
And you felt called recently to go in doing ministry and in this work that you do. How would you describe the sense of calling on your life, especially in those?
If you're living a nice, stable life and you're running a farm and you're milking cows, and all of a sudden everything changes around you. I'm just using that as an example. And it indicates that this is not what you should be doing anymore, because there's something else that needs doing rather more importantly. All the laws change in your country, and for various reasons you have to leave, or I'm just trying to think of a scenario that could, somebody gets sick and you have to change your profession as a result, all that kind of thing. Anything that suddenly happens that changes your entire surroundings and makes you think this isn't where I should be. Then you have to pray lots. And you have to say, well, Lord, where am I supposed to go? And things will channel and change to point you in specific directions. You take that direction. I mean, we arrived in Ireland after 14 years of farming in Tasmania, knowing the Lord had worked for us there without a clue what it was going to be. And so we get to Ireland, and we said, what do we do next? Buy a house. All right, we'll buy a house. We started looking for a cottage. My wife and myself and 2 daughters were all that were left living at home. Buy a mansion. Oh, yeah. So we went. He directed us straight to a particular house. And being stubborn and stupid, I decided we better look at some other places as well. So we went all around Ireland looking at great big houses. And no, back to that one. That's the one you're supposed to. So we went back and we bought the place. Now what, Lord? Get the house ready. For what? Don't worry, just get it ready. So we started renovating the house, which we did. 6 months later, and 32 guys working for me, and I was exhausted, and the house was ready. And the first trainee group of psychotherapists dealing with post-abortion problems in women arrived to be trained at our house. The very day the workmen were walking out of the bedrooms carrying their tools, the guests were walking into the bedrooms, passing in the doorways. The Lord times things down to the split second. It's uncanny. Well, of course it's uncanny. It's God. But that's the way it sort of happens. And then you do this, you do whatever the Lord has called you to do until he decides to change the circumstances and everything again in various ways. And then you go to the next place. It's not like I hear a voice saying, "Hey, Doug, I want you to kill that pig," or whatever, you know. It's more like the whole structure of where you're living changes in a way that indicates it's time to go somewhere else.
And you find perhaps looking back that, like in Horse and His Boy, Aslan was there at every turn?
Right through my life, looking back with honest memory, right through my life, right back to my youngest childhood, the things that should have killed me and didn't, over and over again, the crazy stunts that should have killed me and didn't, coming close to death several times, and something intervening. And everything I have ever done in my life turns out to be training all along for what I'm doing right now. If you follow Christ, that's what happens. You might be a plumber, plumbing a household, and then give it up to go and become, I don't know, a sports director or something. And you suddenly learn when you're old enough and you're ready to hand yourself entirely to Christ that you will use all of those skills you've picked up all along the way in your life to doing what Christ wants you to do in the end.
Thank you.
Very good. Let's give him a great hand here. And Hannah Fields? I have an idea. Come on up here. President Perrin, would you mind your video chat for your Facebook? Let's do it right here in front of all these people. So indulge us for about 90 seconds with Douglas Gresham. And Hannah, I want you to, you got your phone? So face this way so that the audience is in the background, and President Perrin and Douglas, you'll be right here. Is that good? President Perrin is trying to boost his Facebook ratings. That's what this is about.
Well, we're here with Douglas Gresham. We're here with Douglas Gresham, who's been visiting LCU today. Welcome to LCU. We're so glad that you're here.
It's been great.
We've enjoyed it more than you have. It's been great. And we want to share you with my Facebook world. And just I'd love for you just to say a word about what it was like growing up in the household of C.S. Lewis and with your mom.
Oh, that was a great time for education. I mean, there were great sadnesses in that household at the time because my mother was slowly dying of cancer. But within that sort of sadness and this sort of Damocles hanging over our heads all the time, there was also great joy and great laughter. It was a house full of fun because Jack himself had a wonderful sense of humor. My mother was a very courageous lady. So we all knew that this would come to an end. And as with all marriage, I mean, every marriage in the world ends badly. Either one partner dies and the other goes on, or they both die. But they separate, which is worse. But all marriages end badly. We knew this one was going to. And yet at the same time, there was great joy and laughter and love in that household. So it was a time of pain, sorrow, delight, and joy. As I've often said, joy and sorrow are twin sisters born of the same mother, and that mother is love. And that's what that household was infused with. And it's wonderful memories.
And you're here because you're producing a record album. I want you to say a word about that. All my Facebook friends need to know about this.
I actually produced it as executive producer, and we also have a music producer, a great guy named Chris Hopper up in upstate New York. And it's the songs of the young lady called Meg Sutherland. And Meg is extraordinarily talented. And she writes her own lyrics. They come through her, I think, from the Holy Spirit of God. She writes the lyrics, she writes the music, she plays the piano part and sings the songs. They're incredibly beautiful and beautifully recorded and wonderfully produced, of course.
Yes.
Of course. But I think the album is called Courage Dear Heart. It will hit the markets completely on next Tuesday. And it's by Meg Sullivan. I heartily recommend it to everybody, whether you're Christian or not, and if you're even human or not. If you're an alien, pick it up. You know? It's well worth listening to, I assure you. And I'm very proud of all the works I've done, the movies I've made, and so on. This is the thing at the moment I'm most proud of. So please do have a look.
Thank you, Douglas. Buy the